Okay, so let's dive in. What if the very rules our brains use, to make sense of everything? These basic laws of logic, what if they actually point to something, well, beyond themselves?
Hmm.
You shared some really fascinating stuff, especially that article about the law of non-contradiction.
Right, the Anderson and Welty piece.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to unpack this argument, this idea that logical laws actually hinge on the existence of God.
It's a pretty profound claim, not just abstract
Right.
concepts.
It makes you think these aren't just academic ideas, are they? They're saying these like fundamental rules of reality themselves point somewhere deeper.
That's the core of it. Yeah, this deep dive is all about exploring that connection logic and, well, the concept of God.
And the main source is that article you mentioned.
Yeah, primarily The Lord of Non-Contradiction, An Argument for God from Logic by James Anderson and Greg Welty. They really build a case. They argue that logic isn't just floating out there abstractly.
But it's fundamentally dependent on God.
That's their argument, yes.
Yeah.
Metaphysically dependent.
Okay. And for everyone listening, for you, the learner, who likes getting up to speed quickly, but, without feeling totally overwhelmed,
Right.
we're going to take this philosophical argument, which, let's be honest, can sound pretty complex, and we'll break it down.
Get at digestible parts.
Exactly. We'll focus on the key insights, maybe those aha moments, and some of the surprising angles. Really understand why this is intriguing and what the implications might be.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's start right at the beginning. When we say laws of logic in the context of this paper, what exactly are we talking about?
Okay, yeah, good place to start. So Anderson and Welty, they define these laws of logic as the really basic axiomatic principles of rational thought.
Axiomatic, meaning like foundational.
Assumed.
Foundational, yeah. Principles that govern how statements, things that can be true or false, what philosophers call truth-valued statements, how they relate to each other in ways that reliably lead to truth.
Gotcha. So the bedrock rules for thinking straight. And they give some classic examples, don't they, to make it concrete. They do. They mention the three big ones, usually traced back to Aristotle.
Okay.
There's the law of identity, basically. If something's true, it's true. A is A.
Simple enough.
Then the law of non-contradiction. This is a big one for them. No statement can be both true and false at the same time in the same respect.
Right. Can't be raining and not raining right here, right now.
Exactly. And the third is the law of excluded middle. Any given statement has to be either true or false. There's no third option, no middle ground.
Okay, those sound, well, pretty obvious, almost. Hard to argue with.
You'd think so. But, the authors do acknowledge that even these fundamental principles have faced challenges from some philosophers.
Really? Like, people argue against the law of non-contradiction.
Some do, yeah. But here's a really crucial point for their argument. It doesn't actually depend on us accepting those specific three laws as the only ones, or even needing those exact formulations.
Ah, okay. So what does it depend on?
It just depends on the idea that there are laws of logic, that there are some fundamental rules governing rational thought and truth. The specific list isn't the main thing.
So it's the existence of a framework, not the precise details of the framework.
Precisely. And they kind of make this point almost rhetorically.
Yeah.
They ask, how could you even rationally debate whether there are laws of logic?
Without using logic in your debate.
Exactly. You'd be assuming the very thing you're trying to deny just by engaging in rational argument. It's sort of self-defeating.
That's a neat point. It really makes you think about the ground rules for any conversation, any argument.
It does.
Okay, so these laws exist in some form. And the authors then say these laws, they are themselves truths.
Yes, that's the next step. Their first main assertion is that the laws of logic are truths. They possess the property of being true.
Like the sky is blue is true, the law of non-contradiction is also true.
Exactly. Whatever else it is, the statement, no proposition can be both true and false, is itself true. It accurately describes a feature of reality, specifically about truth and falsehood.
Okay. And then they bring in this philosophical term, propositions. Why is that important?
Right. So philosophers often use the word proposition to talk about the underlying meaning or the content of a statement. The thing that is actually true or false, separate from the specific words or language used to express it.
Ah, okay. Like le ciel est bleu in French and the sky is blue in English.
They express the same proposition.
Got it. Different sentences, same core truth claim.
Exactly. And the laws of logic, being truths, are understood as propositions in this sense. The law of non-contradiction isn't just the English sentence, it's the underlying concept, the single truth that could be stated in any language.
So it's not just a linguistic convention, it's pointing to something more fundamental.
And that's the idea. It suggests it's a truth about how things are, not just how we talk.
Now, what about the objection that maybe these laws aren't truths themselves, but more like relationships between truths? Does that derail the argument?
That's a fair question. And they address it. They say, okay, even if you view them primarily as relations, like how different propositions connect or the structure they have, there
Mhm.
still have to be truths about those relations.
I
You
see.
still need to be able to state truly how those relations work. And those statements, those truths about the relations, well, those are effectively what we mean by the laws of logic in this context.
So the argument still holds. Okay, so the law of non-contradiction then. It's a truth about truths and falsehoods.
Precisely put, it's a truth about the nature of truth and falsehood themselves. It states a fundamental relationship. No proposition, no truth bearer can have both the property of being true and the property of being false simultaneously.
And this applies across the board to any statement.
Yes, completely general. Doesn't matter if you're talking about physics or history or what you had for breakfast. The law holds for all propositions.
Okay, so they're truths. They're about truths. But then there's this idea of necessity. They aren't just true. They have to be true.
Exactly. This is a really critical step in their argument. They claim these aren't just contingent truths, truths that happen to be the case but could have been otherwise.
Like, the Allies won World War II is true, but we can imagine a scenario where it wasn't. That's contingent.
Right. Logical laws, they argue, are different. They are necessary truths. They couldn't possibly have been false.
So there's no possible way reality could have been structured such that, say, contradictions were fine.
That's what they're arguing. They use the concept of possible worlds here, basically. Different ways reality could have unfolded.
Oh,
And they say the laws of logic are true in every single possible world. You can imagine a world with different physical laws, maybe, but not one where P and not P are both true simultaneously.
But couldn't someone just say they imagine a world with a law of non-contradiction is false?
Well, they'd address that thought. Their counter is that our very understanding of what constitutes a possible world seems tied to logical consistency, especially non-contradiction.
Meaning the idea of possibility itself depends on this law.
Kind of, yeah. How do we distinguish a genuinely possible scenario from just, well, an incoherent jumble of words? Usually it involves checking for consistency. So the idea of a possible world where non-contradiction fails is problematic, perhaps even incoherent itself.
It feels almost self-evident, that necessity.
They suggest it has that quality, yes. Now, they do briefly acknowledge challenges, things like dialetheism, the idea that maybe some contradictions are true, and also Cartesian universal possibilism, which questions the whole idea of necessary truths. But their point remains that for their argument to work, you just need some fundamental logical laws to be necessary truths about truth itself.
Okay, so laws of logic are truths, they're about truths, and they're necessarily true.
Got it.
Now, the next step seems like a big one. They argue these laws actually exist, like really exist, not just as ideas in our heads.
Yes. This is where they shift from describing what the laws are, necessary truths propositions, to arguing that they are real entities.
Like tables and chairs exist, or the pyramids exist.
Well, not in the same way. They're very clear they don't mean they're physical, concrete objects, but they argue they have genuine ontological reality. They exist.
Okay, how do they argue for that? Seems like a leap from true to exists.
They offer 4 lines of reasoning. The first one starts with just how we talk, our ordinary language.
How so?
We say things like, there are laws of logic, or the law of non-contradiction is fundamental. When we use phrases like there are X's or X is Y, we usually presuppose that X actually exists.
So the way we naturally speak about them implies they're real things.
That's the suggestion. And they argue the burden of proof should be on the person who wants to say our language is misleading here, that these things don't actually exist, despite us talking as if they do.
Interesting. Okay, what's the second argument? Something about intuition.
Yes, it appeals to a kind of ontological intuition. The basic idea is, only things that genuinely exist can have real effects or constraints on us.
Their logic clearly affects how we think, how we argue, what's possible.
Exactly. Logic undeniably influences our cognitive lives, our science, everything. If only existing things have effects, and logic has effects, then, well, the conclusion seems to be that logic must exist.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of intuitive sense. What about the third point? It was about verbs like know or believe.
Right, this one's a bit more technical, focusing on the structure of sentences. When we use verbs like know, believe, doubt, often the object of that verb is a proposition, usually introduced by that.
Like, I know that the earth is round.
Precisely. Or in this context, Smith knows that no statement can be both true and false. The argument is that for Smith to know that thing, the thing itself, the proposition, the law of non-contradiction, must exist.
You can't know something that doesn't exist.
Basically, yeah. Just like you can't kick a non-existent ball, the structure suggests you can't know or doubt a non-existent proposition. Its existence is presupposed by the verb.
Okay, that's subtle but interesting. And the final argument, something about having properties.
Yes, the fourth argument is about property attribution. The principle is only things that exist can possess properties.
Like, this microphone has the property of being black. It has to exist first.
Right. And the laws of logic, as we establish, have the property of being true. Since they have a property, truth, they must exist as the bearers of that property.
So truth is a property and logic has it, therefore logic must exist.
That's the argument. They also tackle the deflationary theory of truth here, the idea that saying P true is just another way of saying P, and that true isn't a real property.
And they disagree with that.
They argue against it, suggesting that the proposition that grass is green is true actually does mean something more than just grass is green, implying truth is a genuine property requiring an existing subject.
And they also push back against the idea that they're just like making an abstract concept into a thing, the fallacy of reification.
Exactly. They preempt that objection. They stress, again, they're not saying logical laws are concrete, things like rocks. They're arguing for the real existence of abstract entities. And they point out that just flatly denying the existence of all abstract objects is itself a controversial philosophical stance that needs defending, not just assuming.
Okay, so let's recap the chain so far. Laws of logic are truths, necessary truths, and they actually exist as real, albeit abstract, entities.
Correct.
So if they exist and they are necessary truths, does that mean they exist necessarily?
That's the direct implication, yes.
Mm-hmm.
If something is a necessary truth, true in all possible worlds, and it exists, then it must exist in all possible worlds.
Yeah.
Its existence is necessary, just like its truth.
Because if it didn't exist in some possible world, it couldn't be true in that world.
Precisely. Necessary truth implies necessary existence for these entities. They revisit the arguments from ordinary language and property attribution, suggesting these also point towards necessary existence. Yeah. We talk about logic being true in all scenarios, having the property of truth necessarily.
Okay. Real, necessary, abstract entities, not physical. So what kind of thing fits that description? This is where the connection to thoughts comes in, right?
Exactly. This is the pivot point. They introduce the philosophical concept of intentionality.
Intentionality, like intending to do something.
Not quite in the everyday sense. In philosophy, it means aboutness or directedness. Thoughts, beliefs, desires, they're always about something. They point beyond themselves.
My belief that it's Tuesday is about today's date.
Perfect example. Propositions, including the laws of logic, inherently possess this intentionality. The law of non-contradiction is about the relationship between truth and falsehood.
Okay, and they mention two aspects of this, directedness and a spectral shape.
Yes. Directedness is the pointing towards. A spectral shape is about how something is presented. Think of their Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens example.
Right, same person. But thinking Mark Twain wrote Tom Sawyer is a different thought than Samuel Clemens wrote Tom Sawyer, because they present the subject under a different aspect, a different description.
Exactly. That way of presenting is the aspectual shape. Now, the crucial claim is that this kind of intrinsic intentionality, this inherent aboutness and aspectual shape, is the distinctive mark of the mental.
Of thoughts.
Of thoughts, yes.
Yeah.
Beliefs, ideas, concepts. Physical things, they argue, don't have this intrinsic intentionality. A book is about something only because a mind intended it to be, wrote it, or reads it. Its intentionality is derived.
So a rock isn't inherently about anything.
Right. But a thought is inherently about its object.
Okay, I think I follow. So since propositions, and therefore the laws of logic, are intrinsically intentional.
The conclusion they draw is that propositions are best understood as being mental in nature. They are essentially thoughts.
Wow. Okay. So laws of logic, necessary truths, necessary existing abstract entities, thoughts.
That's the chain they've built.
But whose thoughts? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If they exist necessarily, they can't be my thoughts or yours.
Exactly, because we are contingent beings. We might not have existed. Our thoughts are contingent. But the laws of logic, they argue, exist necessarily true in all possible worlds.
So they must be the thoughts of a mind that also exist necessarily.
That's the deduction. These necessary true existing thoughts must belong to a mind whose existence is not contingent, but necessary, a necessarily existent mind.
And a necessarily existent mind. What is that?
Well, they argue that a mind implies a person, a thinking subject.
Yeah.
So a necessarily existent mind implies a necessarily existent person, and a necessarily existent personal thinking non-physical being.
Is what we typically understand as God.
That is the connection they make, yes.
So that's the argument. It flows from logic is true, all the way to logic is the thought of a necessary mind, i.e. God.
That's the full chain of reasoning they present. Laws of logic are necessary truths about truths, which means they are necessary true propositions, which exist as real non-physical entities, which possess intentionality, suggesting they are essentially thoughts, necessarily existent true thoughts, which require a necessarily existent mind, the mind of a necessarily existent personal, spiritual being we call God.
They're careful to say it's not, absolute mathematical proof.
No, it's presented as a philosophical argument, a case to be considered, but potentially a strong one.
And the implications are pretty staggering if you accept it.
There really are. Firstly, it reframes logic itself. The laws of logic aren't some abstract standard that God merely conforms to.
They're God's thoughts.
Divine thoughts about the essential relations between divine thoughts. Logic conforms to God because logic is God thinking.
And that leads to that irony they mentioned.
Right, the implication that any logical argument, even one attempting to disprove God's existence, relies on the laws of logic. But if this argument holds, those very laws are grounded in the divine mind.
So using logic assumes the existence of the very thing you might be trying to argue against.
That's the paradoxical conclusion, yeah. They draw a parallel to moral arguments for God.
Where people argue that objective moral laws require a divine lawgiver.
Exactly. This is similar, but for logical laws. It suggests God is the ultimate ground, not just for morality, but for rationality itself.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up for the listener, for you, the learner,
Yeah.
what's the big takeaway here?
I think the main thing is seeing this potential really deep connection proposed between something seemingly abstract and impersonal, the rules of logic, and something profoundly personal and necessary, the mind of God.
It challenges us maybe to see the order and rationality in the universe not just as brute facts, but as potentially rooted in something or someone intentional.
Yeah, it shifts the perspective, and it leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on, doesn't it?
Definitely. Like if logic is in some sense God's thought, how does that change how we view knowledge or reasoning or even God?
Could exploring logic itself become a way, maybe an unexpected way, of exploring ultimate reality? It opens up interesting avenues.
It really does. And obviously, we've just scratched the surface here. This intersection of logic, metaphysics, philosophy of religion, it's incredibly rich.
Absolutely. There's so much more to explore. Thinkers like Plantinga, Aquinas, the different views on necessity and propositions.
So we definitely encourage listeners to dig deeper if this sparked something. What parts of the argument stood out most? What questions does it raise for you personally? That's where the real learning continues.
Couldn't agree more.